Greetings, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Fabiano de Andrade Correa. I'm here in my capacity of co-chair of the IUCN WCEL Climate Change Loss Specialist Group, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to our discussion this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are. I'm just going to give a few more seconds so that people connect across the world. We did have quite a good response to the webinar invitation, and we're looking forward to a very interactive discussion with our speakers today. We are fortunate to have a great lineup, and I'm very excited about our discussion. Perhaps as people log in, a few words of introduction into the context of the webinar and what brings us together here today. As I mentioned, I have the pleasure of co-chairing the IUCN WCEL Climate Change Loss Specialist Group together with Professor Francesco Sindico from Strathclyde University. The IUCN, as you know, is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and within IUCN, the World Commission on Environmental Law, or WCEL, is the biggest network worldwide of environmental law specialists working purely on a volunteer basis to advance knowledge and dissemination of knowledge products on key aspects of international environmental law. Within WCEL, we have several specialist groups, as we call them, and the Climate Change Law Specialist Group is one of the biggest of them. We have a membership of 400 plus members worldwide specializing in climate change law. And within this mandate, we divide ourselves in subtopics, including climate change litigation, climate change in oceans, climate change in cities, and legal aspects of nature-based solutions, which is the context really that brings us together today to discuss the topic of the legal architecture for scaling investments in nature-based solutions. As you know, nature-based solutions are defined as actions that protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems to address societal challenges such as climate change, water security, or disaster risk effectively and adaptively. IUCN was a driving force behind the very definition of NBS, which are nowadays really widely recognized as a necessary element in the fight against climate change, but also combining with other key priorities such as the protection of biodiversity and etc. The IPCC has been consistently flagging that NBS need to be a part of climate solutions, and while not a panacea, they obviously offer a lot of advantages, while also requiring at the same time sound legal and structural framework in order to be able to be properly developed. And that's really the rationale behind our discussion today. We're hoping to dive into the key aspects of the legal architecture that is needed so that we can scale investments into nature-based solutions. So to discuss this topic with us today, we have Jess Mosier, who is the General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer at Chestnut Carbon. We have Rick Sains, who is the Managing Partner at Ardent Climate. Sam Johnston, who is the Director at the International Savannah Fire Management Initiative. And Vanika Chola, who is the Director and Head of Legal at Climate Asset Management, and with whom I have the pleasure of co-directing this cluster on nature-based solutions within the IUCN WCEL Climate Change Law Specialist Group. So we have about 75 minutes for this discussion, and we're going to be dividing the flow of the topic into 8 sub-blocks. I'll ask speakers a few specific questions, and each will have about 5 minutes to provide an answer, and we will be progressing through that structure. We encourage participants to interact with the speakers through the chat. You are able to ask questions, and we will be monitoring the chat and posing the questions to the speakers as we go. And towards the end of the webinar, we will have some time to closing remarks and to ask speakers to address the most relevant questions in the chat. So without further ado, let's get started, and I'll ask Rick to get us started, addressing to get us, to begin with a bit of the global legal framework on this matter. Rick, if you could expand to us on what are NBS in practice, and from a legal and market perspective, what types of global frameworks support them.
Okay.
And welcome, Rick.
Thank you, Fabiano. Thank you, Veronica, for having all of us on the panel. This is a really important topic, timely topic. And so it's a delight to be here and appreciate the opportunity to share these discussions with everybody. And we do encourage questions, and hopefully we can also among us have some interesting back and forth as well. But just to sort of set the stage or give the overview, as Fabiano said, talk about the types of NBS activities that are out there, what's currently being financed, and under what global frameworks essentially support that financing. And I think it's important to note that there's lots of activities that are very important, that provide tremendous value for the world and for the climate and for ecosystems, that do a range of things. But it's safe to say, to date and thus far, the majority of finance that has flowed for nature-related activities, particularly in respect of the climate, has been based on carbon, a carbon metric, and carbon finance. But that's not to say that that's the only source of potential long-term finance, and it's not the only measure of value and measure of the importance of what nature provides to the world. But I do think when we talk about this, it's likely that we're going to dive deeply, and all of a sudden we'll be talking about carbon markets pretty quickly here. But I don't want that to be an indication that we see that as the only value that nature brings. I think our economies, our social governance, our systems need to continue to evolve to reflect the value that's there. And carbon has worked to a degree because of certain features of the carbon system and the atmospheric system related to the science and how markets can survive and thrive in that environment. Whereas biodiversity is a bit more complex. Not to say, though, that we shouldn't keep working on those types of measures and opportunities to value nature as a living system that provides all kinds of benefits to society and to the world, and we should make sure we're continuing to value those things. So with that, I just wanted to make that statement because pretty quickly we're going to start talking about carbon. And I think a lot of times when we talk about nature as a whole, there are many who feel like, we jump too quickly to carbon, but there's a reason, because carbon has actually been the source of the majority of the financing for nature systems to date. So what do we talk about nature? Fabiano, you mentioned that well, but what's being financed? Afforestation and reforestation, so tree planting programs, protection of blue, what we call blue carbon or mangroves, wetlands, soil carbon is being financed, regenerative agriculture, agroforestry activities, and conservation itself. I mean, the reduction of emissions from deforestation and forest degradation remain really important. There's a lot of discussions about removals, and the role that nature plays in absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere, removing CO2, vitally important, tremendously important, but we should not take our eye off the continued importance of reducing the emissions from the destruction, degradation, burning, land use change, etc., of nature, because that remains a very significant source of global emissions annually. And we need to, we need to address that as well. It's like sort of burning the candle on both ends. We need to make sure we're not just focusing on removals and increasing removals if we're still if we're still burning, and emitting from the sector. So those are both really important. In terms of the legal instruments, it's everything from international architecture under the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and a feature that was born out of the Paris Agreement called Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which enables the transfer of mitigation outcomes between sovereigns themselves, but also authorize private activities within that system. And that essentially becomes a carbon market, a global carbon market. There are other UN-based programs like the Global Aviation System, which sets up a mandate for airlines around the world to basically cap their emissions at 2020 levels and grow in the sector in a carbon neutral manner. And so as the aviation sector is growing year on year, those emissions are climbing. And one way that the system is designed is to produce offsets to offset those impacts. And that's a compliance system that designates certain eligible activities, including nature. Right now, it's at the jurisdictional level. We can talk about project-based versus jurisdictional programs. That could be interesting. Voluntary carbon markets have been operating for, upwards of 30 years now. And it's really, remains an important laboratory of innovation. It remains an important means by which corporations around the world can do their part in helping to decarbonize their own footprints. And those standards are evolving as well. And there's a lot of sort of what I would say harmonization increasingly around quote unquote, high integrity outcomes, overarching umbrella standards like ICVCM and something called the core carbon principles, which start to govern, various standards in the voluntary market that an increasing cohort of actors, look to. And then, as I mentioned, it's not just about carbon. There are increasing efforts to find ways to finance, whether it be specific adaptation and resilience performance of nature, coastal resilience, flood mitigation and management, green infrastructure, those kinds of things, but also biodiversity itself. And there's been a lot of efforts to try to figure out what lessons can we learn from the carbon markets that we can apply responsibly to the biodiversity realm, and how can we support biodiversity? So what I would say is sometimes people talk about, the carbon market. It's really a series of different markets for different contexts. And while I would say that a lot of assets or commodities are physical, and you can understand the nature of how those markets work, carbon and the instruments of performance around nature are a policy created asset. The assets are created by norms, rules, whether they be voluntary standards or metrics or laws and regulations. And so those laws, regulations, and norms, the rules of the road, the rules of the game, define the markets. And it's not just one market. There's fragmented markets, there's domestic markets, regional markets, international markets. Um, so it's a complex legal environment within which, operators like ourselves are working, but it's one that is really starting to take shape, I would say, with the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, the international architecture, kind of starting to work a little bit more in a consolidated manner with the voluntary standards, and we can get into that, but we're starting to see some I say the word convergence, others don't like that word, but I think you're starting to see more clarity around what high integrity systems look like, and then more governments, standards, regions starting to peg to those or starting to recognize those. And when you have that, you start to get the opportunity for scale, which I know this is about. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that's a good sort of background.
Perfect. Many thanks, Rick, for getting us started. And now let me turn to Varnika, who, as I mentioned, is leading our NBS cluster within the IUCN WCEL Climate Change Law Specialist Group. And I think one issue that Varnika and I very much agreed when we started to think about this is that being able to scale finance into NBS is really a key aspect, so that these issues can really take off. So Varnika, following from the background that Rick just provided, in your view, what is the legal architecture that is needed to scale NBS in emerging markets? Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Fabiano, and thanks, Rick, as well, for that rich and colorful background on where we are more globally, and then looking to narrow it down to carbon as really a source of providing that catalytic financing and the pathway to enable large-scale financing to flow into nature-based solutions, while we try to institutionalize this asset class for climate and nature. But I think the legal architecture that we've sort of been discussing, both Fabiano and I, and also looking at climate asset management, is extensive, and it is complicated, that will be required to scale this asset class. But just to distill it down into maybe the four fundamental aspects, and internally we call them the 4 E's for the legal architecture that we seek to establish across every investment that we make into nature-based solutions. And the first would be effective land tenure systems. And so we're looking at land-based, nature-based solutions, and not necessarily diving into ocean-based or beyond land. But one of the key aspects is to establish effective land tenure. And that's because often in a lot of jurisdictions, your carbon rights flow alongside rights to land. And unless you've got clarity on that land tenure, it is difficult to establish who the contract for transfer of those rights and transfer of ownership of carbon should really sit with. So that's one of the critical challenges, especially in emerging markets, is trying to establish, especially large scale, where you're working with aggregations of smallholder farmers or local communities and indigenous people, where often they may not have the same land tenure legal systems that you would expect in the UK or the US, as an example. And so you have to look at community law, and see how that fits in with the domestic law perspective in that jurisdiction, and then try to align that with the legal requirements of the jurisdiction from where capital is flowing. So that's often an imbalance that needs to be established at the upfront. The second E, I would say, is equity, and this will ensure longer term permanence. And by equity, I mean working together with the people that own the land. So typically this would be local communities, smallholder farmers, or indigenous people who've been on that land for multiple generations. So working to co-design nature-based solutions projects with them will ensure longer-term permanence of your asset. And so rather than looking at the project through a linear carbon perspective of decarbonization purely, you should look at it as a more holistic ecosystem development exercise, where you're working together with the local communities to ensure an equitable outcome for both them and for the decarbonization targets that you're looking to achieve. So one of the key aspects there, of course, is establishing free, prior, and informed consent of the communities that you're working with, but more importantly, ensuring revenue structure clarity. and equitable benefit sharing so that the communities are equal owners and partners in the project will ensure longer term survival of the project well beyond the crediting period for any carbon as well. So moving from there to the third E, and I think this is critical for scaling this asset class, is efficient structuring options. And that's essentially where you can attract a huge amount of institutional capital, where you can show that the asset that you're investing into has been efficiently structured and adjusted for any risk return outcomes. So a typical parallel we look to draw would be from infrastructure as another asset class, where you can have project financing structures with SPVs, specifically ring fencing your investment and your assets and the material contracts thereunder, and ensuring that you've got rights to control and govern the project in a way that would attract credibility from institutional capital to allow investments into this space. And moving then to the fourth E would be enforceability. And that's enforceability of your contract to make sure that the contract that you've got between your financing structures and across different levels is actually enforceable across each of those levels, but also enforceability of your security that you take as part of your structuring options. So if you've got security in, for example, future intangible assets such as carbon credits. And I can see Rick smiling. Maybe Rick, you want to jump in on this as well. But the most challenging aspect here to establish is often how do you actually secure the rights that haven't yet been generated as part of your funding? And that's where you have to look at a lot of multi-jurisdictional requirements of where's the asset located, where's the SPV located, where's the investment coming from, where will the carbon credits be generated or the nature-based assets be generated, and within that holistic framework, where can you actually take security to ensure enforceability of your contract? So I'll stop there, but maybe Rick, would you like to jump in as well?
Oh, sure. I can maybe just tack on. That was great, Veronica. Yeah, I mean, first question is, having clarity that the asset that you're talking about is an intangible, a general intangible or an intangible asset as defined under the law. And in some jurisdictions, you also have to look and say, well, has the government, has the constitution of that country or the place that you're undertaking those activities defined carbon in any way? In most cases, the answer is no, because it's relatively new. This is a new type of asset, but that is an increasing feature of a lot of countries that are starting to develop their domestic, rules and laws around carbon markets because of the Paris Agreement in Article 6. There are obligations on countries to implement certain domestic measures to be able to be ready to participate in the Article 6 markets. And as we know, there's a whole bunch of activity going around in terms of MOUs and implementation agreements and various early stage undertakings. But behind that, and as part of that, there's going to be a legal architecture in each of these countries. And one fundamental question is, what is a carbon credit under the law? And who has the rights to own it? Back to your points, Varnica. And from that, then you can analyze the question about whether or not it is an asset that is pledgeable for collateral. And we, and there's a bunch of work being done in UNIDRA around this question of like the legal nature of a verified carbon credit and the role that it can play in project finance. And the general premise, as you say, is that in most cases it's a general intangible. You can have property rights in it. It can be owned exclusively and it can be transferred. So in that sense, it has the indicia of property sufficient for it to be pledged as collateral. But the means of perfecting your security interest in an asset that's intangible, that sits on an electronic registry from servers in one place, from activities in another, governed by a debtor whose corporate headquarters are in a third jurisdiction, it requires a legal analysis as to what's the best means to actually perfect, as a creditor, actually perfect your security interest. And usually our advice is sort of, what do you call it, belt and suspenders, or, like, don't just think of it as one thing, like do a few different things to cover the landscape because, courts haven't had the occasion to really resolve a lot of these issues in these kind of multi-jurisdictional contexts. So it's, as a creditor, you just want to make sure you have practicable enforceability and as many legal options as possible to perfect your security interest. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Veronica and Rick. That was super interesting, and I think you gave me just a great segue to turn now to Jesse. Moving from these more general issues into more concrete market context discussions. Jesse, I understand your work at Chestnut Carbon focuses a lot on the US market. So thinking about a developed market context, how does this developed market context shape up your work around NBS and the development of initiatives in this area? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Fabiano, and to the rest of my panelists. As everyone said, my name is Jesse Mosier. I'm the general counsel of Chestnut Carbon, which is a U.S. Focused carbon, nature-based carbon credit project developer. And I've been here for about 2 years. However, prior to this, I was general counsel of a company called Pachama, and that was my first foray into the carbon credit space and the nature-based solution carbon credit space. And Pachama primarily operated in Latin America. And so my framework for learning about this was initially through the emerging markets framework. And so taking some of those lessons and porting them over to the US, which is in some ways more advanced on issues like rule of law, land tenure, and financial markets, capital markets, financing that's available, and in some ways behind in that the US is probably not a party to the Paris Agreement and has no access to Article 6 mechanisms or CORSIA, and so I spend a lot less time thinking about compliance mechanisms and regulatory regimes because the US is a bit of a free-for-all, and we're pretty much focused on the voluntary carbon market space here. We do have in some state level jurisdictions compliance mechanisms, California most notably the CARB, and Chestnut has historically played a little bit in that space, but it's not a focus of our attention right now, given some of the structural impediments to, frankly, the business case for participating there. Other developers in the US might disagree with that. I would say, we have 50 states in the US and land tenure and the nature of contracts and the nature of carbon credits are technically all governed at the state level here. And Chestnut, as a developer, we have two types of projects. We have the one that we're most famous for, which is our afforestation reforestation project, which is located in about 10 states in the southeast of the US. And there we have about 70,000 acres that we've purchased and have reforested. That's about 28,000 hectares. That's a very capital intensive approach to project development, but we've managed to underpin that project with a 25-year offtake agreement with Microsoft to deliver across 3 contracts we have about close to 8 million tons over 25 years. And with that bankable offtake agreement, we were able to go out and get a $210 million traditional project finance facility led by JP Morgan, the Bank of Montreal, East West Bank, and some of the ag credit lenders here as well. It was kind of a first of its kind project finance structure in the US, bringing traditional infrastructure project finance to the nature-based carbon credit space for what we understand is the first time. We also have an IFM strategy where we effectively operate with carbon leases, and we've gone out and rolled about 200 landowners across 200,000 acres, 80,000 hectares in 39 states in the US. And that brings different complexity, a lot harder to get financing for a structure like that. But is interesting in that it requires a lot less capital to get going because we don't have to acquire the land. It's basically a revenue share structure over time. And then in both of these models, believe it or not, in the US, we still do pay attention to a lot of the FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, stakeholder, local community engagements. And in fact, in our afforestation project in the Southeast, we're particularly attuned to it because many of the properties we're buying there are degraded farm and pasture land that have been historically farmed by marginalized, economically or racially marginalized communities. And so we do try hard to pay attention to that stuff. We don't have the formal requirements to do so, other than through the registries and any contractual obligations we might have there. But we care about it deeply. I think where I see the biggest legal impediments here in the U.S. to ongoing financing, what changes to the legal architecture I would make. Our project finance facility is, to Rick's point, kind of a belt and suspenders approach here, except that the lenders have taken collateral over everything except the carbon credits. They just decided to forego that because they have a pledge over the offtake agreements. They have a pledge over the equity interests in the project SPV, and mortgages on all of the material properties underpinning it. And that helped because we use the gold standard for that project, and it's a Swiss law terms and conditions, and the lenders didn't need to go and get involved with UNCITRAL or Swiss law or whatever. We just did it all within the US. I thought that was a pretty easy path forward. Where I think people really, I don't think the lenders fully understood the role of the registries, and in particular the buffer pool and reversal mechanisms. For those who might kind of be new to this, or newer to this, when you plant the trees and issue carbon credits, some percentage of those carbon credits get taken off the top and delivered to a buffer pool that, in our case, the gold standard manages, that is designed to be an asset that's available to all of the gold standard carbon credit projects that are out there. And in the event where there's a hurricane or a tornado or a fire or a blight that takes out a material portion of the trees, you have what's called a reversal. And the gold standard can kind of retire or deprecate some of the carbon credits in the buffer pool. That is interesting to me insofar as when we talk about what permanence means, how long these projects are intended to last. There's a question as to like how long and how meaningful access to those reversal protection mechanisms exist, and how viable they are, and how well funded they are. And I think my biggest complaint is that the terms and conditions of the registries and the transparency with respect to the size and operations of the buffer pool across all the registries. I don't mean to pick on gold standard. They all have this, and it's a known issue. It's uncertain. And so in my contracts, and not just with Microsoft, but with everyone that we talk to, you spend a lot of time negotiating these provisions, and inevitably there's a drag on capital. It makes it more expensive for project developers because they have to effectively come up with other mechanisms to work around the imperfections that are there in the registries. And many buyers are interested in guaranteeing permanence for 100 years, but the gold standard in particular, and many of them are like this, the projects end after 50 years. So there's uncertainty as to what happens in the latter 50 years. So I'd love to clear that up. There are some nascent efforts to kind of find a solution for that outside of the registry systems. So maybe I'll pause there. I think I went over my time, but I would say just as a takeaway, the U.S. is kind of in a niche position, and that we're a developed market. But I do think there are things that can be learned from the U.S. and exported to many of the issues that Varnika is talking about as well. And I just like to underscore a point that Rick made earlier, which is that I view Chestnut Carbon as as an as an ecosystem services firm rather than a carbon credit project developer. And it's really unfortunate. I hope we can change the narrative over time. You know, carbon credits are the mechanism that is available to finance the work that we do. But it's not even in even the most important aspect in my opinion. So I hope we can continue pushing the narrative away from a pure carbon credit structure for these markets and towards a more holistic quantification of nature. Not for quantification's sake, it's just that's how private capital views these things. So
Great. Thank you very much, Jesse. And in fact, we're going to come back to this point of moving towards an ecosystem scale approach to NBS later on during the webinar. But now, moving from a specific market discussion into more of a question of asset management structures, let me turn to Sam. And ask you, Sam, in your work in ISFMI, I understand you work across various continents, Africa, Americas, Asia, supporting indigenous and community-led fire management projects, many of which are designed to long-term running and ultimately becoming community-owned and independently sustainable. From that point of view, what legal and governance architecture is needed to structure community-led NBS as an investable long-term asset, while obviously respecting indigenous rights and etc. What does exist and what does still fall short? Over to you.
So thank you very much, and thanks to all the panelists for their very insightful, interesting kind of comments before, which I'll try and build on. And I think the, the 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 area that we work in is, in my view, after decades of experience in this area around the world, is the best nature-based solution there is, in that it has ticked all the boxes that we've heard are so important, but many more. Very, with high degree of veracity and delivered results, and in all ways. And the example that we use for what's possible when all the things line up is what's happened in Northern Australia. So over the last 10 years in Northern Australia, Indigenous communities who have basically the same economic vulnerabilities as the poorest in Africa and Latin America, are very vulnerable, very disadvantaged, have been able to move from that position of poor poverty and disadvantage to revitalize their local communities through reintroducing traditional fire practices across the landscape, which in effect is really early dry season or spring burning, clearing out the landscape and then making it more resilient to late dry season fires. And that effect reduces the amount of wildfire in the system by about 50%. And that reduction can be measured very accurately using satellite technology and is then turned into regulatory credits in Australia, ACCUs, which generate for these communities really very substantial incomes and allows them to rebuild their communities, their lives, their cultures, and everything, and their health. And it also revitalizes the biodiversity and productivity of the landscape, and that's now being practiced across all of Northern Australia, 1.2 million square kilometres, and generating over $100 million a year for these local communities, which in many cases are very small, only 20, 30, 40 people. And so we've worked over, as Fabiano said, over the last decade or so, exporting that experience and that idea and that technology, if you want, around other fire-dependent landscapes, particularly in Africa and Latin America. And we found that we can produce the same kind of outcomes there. And so I think the key takeaway of that experience for me has been that success is a really important driver of investment. If you can demonstrate that this works, then the communities, the government, the investors, the companies, the developers, they all jump in and they all join and they all become very powerful get very powerful agency and join the market in very, very successfully, even the most disadvantaged communities. So these very poor communities that we've been working in have moved from nothing to being really quite sophisticated corporate managers of their area in a period of 4, 5, 6 years. So that's a really important lesson, which I think is worth bearing in mind, that when we do NBS properly, it delivers amazing results. But that doesn't mean that, and there are workarounds to a lot of the problems because we have this capacity and this interest from all the people. So, as Jesse was saying about permanence, there's for the fire issue, the permanence issue is worked around because the actual reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that is credited is not the entire emissions, it's just the methane and nitrous oxide emissions, which have a terribly long life cycle in the atmosphere. And so they've avoided the risky class, which is the carbon dioxide emissions, and just concentrated on those methane and nitrous oxide emissions. And so they don't have to have a permanence issue, which goes to the veracity of the credit or the legitimacy of the credit, because the credit's issued 1 year for 1 year's work. And if you don't do the work the next year, the previous year's credits are still valid and legitimate. And so that underpins the market by providing incredible confidence in the credit and attracts huge interest. And so these credits now in Australia, for instance, sell at triple the price of normal nature-based solution credits. If you can find them, they're very, very rare at the moment because the communities can't produce enough. But the other thing, which is, and also all the lessons we've heard before really have been ticked, like we heard about the equity issues. The equity issues have been really well addressed. The land tenure issues have been really well addressed and can be addressed in Africa and Latin America with the right kind of know-how and experience and looking at the domestic regulatory regime. So for instance, like we heard out, if there's no carbon legislation, which is the case in most countries, many of the common law countries in Africa, for instance, have a similar property rights system under which they have an old standing right called profit à prendre, that a person who works the land can profit from that work. And under that system, we've been able to recognise carbon rights, which have been able to be issued prior to the carbon policy or carbon legislation or carbon framework coming into place, and which was also the case in Australia. So I think that's the really important issue. That's not to say there aren't challenges in this space, and that's but the real challenges in this space deal with actually not so much the legal issues which we've found working around, but it's kind of just scaling attractive investment and awareness about this. And so bringing people, communicating the message and the success of this has been a really quite a challenging exercise. And so that's something which is always great to talk to other lawyers about and understand, bring awareness that this model here can actually provide a whole lot of lessons for everybody in this space because it's been so successful and can look at, well, it's worked here and therefore maybe we might be able to try it in the areas that we're working in.
Thank you very much, Sam. And to your point, creating a space for lawyers to exchange on these issues is precisely our goal, not just with the webinar, but very much so with the climate change law specialist group as well. So it's great to hear that, and we do hope that these conversations are going to continue within this space. Let me turn now back to Rick and ask you. Obviously, a key development in this space over the last decade has been the Paris Agreement, and within that, Article 6, which is finally taking off after a lot of time in the making in terms of the rule book and etc. So, Rick, in your view, what role does the Article 6 framework play in scaling NBS investment? What do you?
Okay, cool. Thank you, Fabiano. I touched on it a little bit earlier. Maybe I guess we'll do a bit of a deeper dive in Article 6, and I'll try to tie it back to what Jesse was saying about voluntary and again, I this concept of convergence. So as you said, Article 6 took a long time. I mean, Paris, was COP 21. We're, 10 years on from that, and we're just getting going on Paris. And I'm sorry, just getting going on Article 6. One of the statements I heard many years ago from one of the sort of original proponents in the market was that the reason it's so hard is that it's too technical for the politicians and it's too political for the technicians in terms of getting this international agreement on climate and in particular with respect to markets. And so there was a lot of technical elements that were vexing to the political decision makers, and there was a lot of politics that the technical people just were not empowered to overcome. And so you had cop after cop after cop, and then everything else was kind of moving along, and Article 6 was still hanging out there unresolved. But finally, it has been, the rules have been agreed, and some of the early stage infrastructure, the supervisory body under the central mechanism, and so forth. So let me start with an overview. You have Article 6.2, which is this, Article 6, paragraph 2 of the Paris Agreement. And that is a permissive article that allows cooperative approaches and sovereigns to agree bilaterally with other sovereigns to transfer mitigation outcomes under a set of transparency mechanisms and guidance, which really function as a rule set for how to do it. But it is not a central mechanism. The COP or there's no COP body that says, we're issuing the credits and under our rule set. It's a sovereign to sovereign cooperative mechanism. And in that sense, it allows for sovereigns to decide, all right, what is the methodological basis? What standard against which we're going to agree? And now, right now, sovereigns are working on those issues. As I mentioned earlier, there's lots of early stage implementation agreements, MOUs. There's exploration across the landscape with certain buyers like Singapore and Japan and a few others. Some of the Nordic countries are looking to acquire these instruments from a range of different other countries. And they all have their own kind of nuances in terms of the specifics of what they're looking for, the types of units they're excited about, under which conditions. And so there's a lot of activity going on there. But one of the things that's key here is that many governments are undertaking the decision of saying, okay, I want to participate in Article 6. We do need to have registry systems. We do need to have a standard and a methodology and a means by which you can issue these credits, these instruments. And in that context, they're called ITMOs, or internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. And we need a means by which the market, the investors, the proponents will all understand what's being transferred, where that instrument sits, how you can control it and own it. And in that sense, the infrastructure, the methodological underpinnings, the registry systems, and so forth that have existed for, as I mentioned, like around the last 30 years or so in the voluntary market and have been improving are now being considered by sovereigns as the systems that they peg to or that they formally legally recognize. So that's what I mean by convergence. So each country has the opportunity to say, I want to issue, a domestic credit through my own legal system in my own registry. But they also have the opportunity to say, I want to recognize, Vera, Gold Standard, Art Trees, Puro, the various other types of, systems out there, and say those credits under those registry systems will be recognized by us by the sovereign under Article 6 too. Okay. And that is a really interesting development because like Corsia, the aviation system I talked about earlier, what they do is they have a technical advisory body that looks at all the existing programs out there and says, we validate these programs. These are acceptable programs to use in our UN compliant system. California is kind of similar. You know, California is a legal cap and trade system that recognizes the role for credits to come into that system, and they recognize certain standards that they approve. And so you have a voluntary standard, voluntary infrastructure that's born out of the voluntary market that Jesse was talking about, but it gets adopted into compliance systems. And that is a good, I think, development because it starts to consolidate around systems where a broader group of transacting parties, financing parties can all look to certain standards and say, okay, you know, this is an eligible playing field. And for a seller, it provides optionality into which markets these assets can be sold, which is good for financing as well. So if it's Corsia or it's Article 6 or it is the voluntary market or there's a domestic market system that recognizes those instruments, that's really important. So Article 6.2 is big, it's early stage. Countries are setting up their domestic legal frameworks now. And all the topics we've just talked about, countries have to understand those issues and to establish those rules within their domestic systems. 6.4, I'll move on, is an additional the fourth paragraph of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And what it is essentially for those that have operated for a while under the Kyoto Protocol, there was something called the Clean Development Mechanism. And Paris is very different than the Kyoto Protocol because every country now has a commitment that they're presenting as their nationally determined contribution. But Article 6.4 is a central crediting mechanism. So if you don't have, your own sovereign registry system or your own opportunity there, you can still plug into 6.4, and that is a central COP administered program that will set its own methodologies that it approves, and it will issue credits from those methodologies that can be utilized themselves, or if they are utilized for purposes of achieving NDCs, they will be correspondingly adjusted under the system and they become ITMOs. So you have bilateral, you have the central mechanism, and then there's a non-markets mechanism approach under Article 6 as well. And that's not insignificant. It hasn't been the source of the majority of the interest and activity from a financing perspective. But again, I mean, I think there's ways to utilize that to explore some of the non-carbon, let's say, benefits that nature provides that we talked about. And a vitally important point of this is like, I like to think of Article 6 as the on-ramp for private sector, the on-ramp for investment, because it allows sovereigns to authorize private parties to undertake a lot of these activities. So while there's sovereign responsibilities and sovereign outcomes, the private sector is invited in through an authorization process that allows them to be the sort of the activity generators on the ground and also the financiers. And so that relationship between private activities, private finance, and sovereign responsibility, that's another sort of public-private partnership or relationship that is evolving and maturing under Article 6. And I think it's healthy. I mean, the world and governments and the private actors have really gotten good at exploiting nature and extracting nature and destroying nature and how that works and the joint ventures that it gets set up with governments to do resource extraction and mining and fossil and all of the rest of it. This is an opportunity to deploy the same types of systems in a benign, equitable, healthy way for communities and for the relationship between governments and the private sector to come in and reset the relationship with nature in these countries. So that's really exciting. And maybe I'll stop there. I see Jesse has his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that important point, Rick, which is that I'm speaking from the vantage point of an operator in the purely voluntary carbon market space. And so the real cause for lack of scaling of private financing in this space in the US is that there's no there's no guaranteed long-term demand in the voluntary carbon market space. And these compliance mechanisms, whether they're Article 6 or jurisdictional based ones, have the benefit of implying a long-term demand. And so when I want to raise capital for doing project development, I have to first go out and get a long-term offtake agreement. And the number of private companies that are entering into those long-term offtake agreements at the scale and volume and duration that are needed to fund a large infrastructure and to get bank capital, it's basically one. It's Microsoft. Um, and so things are kind of in the reverse direction, in my opinion. And so these compliance mechanisms will allow investors in the private sector capital that you highlighted, Rick, to come in with some more certainty that you don't need everything ticked and tied in an offtake agreement to get started doing the work to develop these. So,
Yeah, really important point. I mean, we've been acting like there's this merchant, wholesale, secondary market, liquid traded market that you can just sell into, like oil or like any of these other globally traded commodities. But the truth is, yeah, I mean, right now you still need that like a project finance approach where you have the offtake, you know. So hopefully we're moving in that more mature direction. But again, back to fragmentation. I mean, each market's different, right? So I like the concept of optionality. I mean, we've done transactions where very I'd say cautious, discerning off-takers, they liked locations where there maybe was a domestic tax that the credits were validated under, even if the pricing wasn't as high as they could get, because it's kind of it's an optional backstop to strategy A. If strategy A doesn't pan out or there's not liquidity at a given moment, you've got some monetization capabilities in a particular market. And looking at those and looking at it holistically around what are the real opportunities to take an asset that's created by a set of very good activities, that's recognized in multiple fora, that creates value. And Varnika, I mean, interested in your view on that as well. That's more valuable than something that only has one route to one market.
Thanks, Rick and Jesse. And in fact, now turning back to Varnika, wanted to ask you if you can build on this point, but also expand on how do investors assess quality and integrity of NBS projects? And then just picking up one of the questions in the chat, does the global IUCN NBS standard play a role in this? Over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Fabiano. And I think just building on from what Rick and Jesse have said as well, one of the key risks for why right now you need to rely on these sort of longer term offtakes and project financing abilities to create scale in this market is because of integrity risk, and integrity risk not only about the nature of the carbon credit that's being created and the various aspects of permanence, additionality, leakage, and governance, but also integrity of what kind of claims can companies actually make if they are going to be using these sorts of carbon credits towards their decarbonization or net zero targets. And unless there is legal clarity across the claims aspect, but also the quality of the credits aspect, there will remain market fragmentation, and investors need to either look at the voluntary mechanisms that Jesse, you've highlighted, but increasingly with Paris now coming into play, the sustainable development tool is a good example of what can be used as part of Article 6 to actually ensure permanence and additionality of the nature-based removal credit that is being generated as a result of your activity. And I think linked to that is key filters that investment strategies use as levers, which are essentially due diligence tools that are absolutely critical in this space to be able to scale capital. And in order to have a meaningful set of tools that can be applied in a uniform manner. As Rick said, you need recognition of certain standard bodies. So like do Vera and Gold Standard or such similar standards start getting recognized within the domestic regulatory frameworks or climate change acts that various countries are now coming up with to ensure that parallel stream of carbon trading or carbon credit generation and retirement as well. So you do need a set of recognized standards. You then also need a set of defensible methodologies that are being uniformly adopted in order to ensure credibility of your investment strategy. So if you know here is a set of technical standards required to ensure that your project is actually capable of generating the reductions in alignment with these very specific technical requirements under a methodology that has been recognized by the core carbon principles as an example, that does create that integrity and credibility within the market. And then linked to that is also development of monitoring, reporting, and verification systems, which is absolutely fundamental to ensure that any sort of reduction or removal that's being created is being monitored and tracked on a regular basis. It is actually a real reduction or removal, and there is an ability to verify it, and you have that transparency within the system itself. So those are the key due diligence aspects that can be built into the regulatory environment as well for countries to actually attract capital at scale within this segment.
Thanks, Varnika. I wanted now to turn back to Jesse and to a point that you started to address before on how do we move from a more project-based approach into scaling into a more ecosystem scale of NBS initiatives.
Yeah, thanks. Chestnut's work is spread out over a large geography. We own 80,000, 70,000 acres in a bunch of different states, and it's fragmented. And we unfortunately don't have the benefit of being quite as strategic with our acquisitions and putting them all together in a way that would make a nice, big, beautiful national park, or even linking biodiversity corridors or the like. But because of the private sector nature of the work we're doing and the fact that we're all kind of structuring this around carbon credits as opposed to the value of nature and biodiversity and water quality, I think there are a lot of areas that we can pull on to improve that. In the US in particular, there is the Clean Water Act, which has created kind of a wetlands mitigation banking structure where anytime a developer, typically for housing or subdivision, wants to develop, even on private land that contains wetlands, they need to offset that with a wetland banking credit. And these credits are generated by developers who go out and restore or create wetlands and mitigate them. And it's a much more holistic approach that values the actual nature and benefits of the wetlands than just the carbon credits. These projects all create carbon sinks as well, but they're not the primary driver of the dollars. I'd love to see something like that in the forest space in the US, kind of improving upon the kind of REDD+ jurisdictional, like how do we, to Rick's point, like how do we prevent stuff from being torn down in a way that releases carbon and ruins biodiversity and the like? And REDD+ goes so far, but putting an explicit cost on removing these trees, I think would be a good next step. On the more kind of like private sector, commercial front, what can we do without regulation? Well, I would just add that like the National Forest Service in the US, which owns a bunch of forest land, has a lot of research that suggests that one of the main principal values of forests is not just the carbon or the recreation that you can do in it or the timber, but really the water quality and filtration and prevention of flooding. And in New York City, where I'm based, there's a really nice history of how we've created a watershed that extends hundreds of miles north of the city through a system of reservoirs and forests to create clean drinking water. And if you're not familiar with that, I think it's a really great ecosystem story to tell that's directly relevant to this. In the more kind of private space, one of the buzzwords of the day is insetting, as opposed to offsetting. Offsetting, you have a company, you have a bunch of emissions from your business activity, so you go out and buy credits from a company like Chestnut Carbon. Insetting is a more directly tied process that's tied directly to your supply chain. So if you're Nestle or if you're McDonald's, you go out and you effectively sponsor a carbon or a nature project that is directly within your supply chain. So improved cattle grazing for McDonald's, or more biodiverse friendly and carbon friendly cacao production if you're Nestle, those sorts of things. And I like that because it's a more holistic approach and really tied towards what I view as the responsibility of corporates to take responsibility for their activities. It implies a lot more benefits to these projects than just the carbon that's happening. I think there are nascent attempts to quantify biodiversity. I think it's going to be hard and potentially risks us going down the same path that we have with carbon, which is like I understand the desire to quantify everything. So I don't know. I don't know the right answer where we'll end up. I think it's going to continue to be fragmented and jurisdictional based, but certainly in the U.S. And this is me speaking in my personal capacity, not as a representative of Chestnut. I'd love to see more regulatory efforts to put in place the mechanisms to value nature that already exists. Rick.
Okay, if I just jump in on something. So yeah, I mean, fascinating stuff, Jesse. I really, everything you said, I endorse. With respect to insetting, I just want to make a comment. I mean, very important to allow corporates to focus their sort of resources on their supply chains. I think that's good. But I think we should make sure we hold those activities to the same level of rigor, third-party verification, methodological quantification, measurement, because when you unitize an instrument under a third-party standard, there's a public process, there's good or bad. I mean, part of the scrutiny that the markets have been subjected to, the reason that scrutiny is there is because the methodologies, the reports, it's a transparent system of MRV, and there's no like sort of black box or less black box, I would say, aspects to some of that. And I know that space is evolving, but I want to make, I just want to make sure that we don't, in the spirit of sort of moving to the next opportunity, we don't incorporate all the best aspects of what the sort of the offsetting system provides for, because there is a risk that you get more opaqueness, less transparency, and less, frankly, verifiability in terms of the underlying performance of what those investments are achieving in the spirit of kind of um, evolution, which I think would be a unintended consequence there. So that point I just wanted to make. The other thing I want to say is when we think about moving from projects to sort of landscape or ecosystem level, that raises the question of jurisdictional approaches versus project-based approaches. And that's something that's kind of been with the Paris Agreement and all countries now having a nationally determined contribution, which is national performance, national emissions inventory reporting. You can think about all activities, not just nature, but any activity is in a sense nested inside of an overall system of national performance. But within nature, the the evolution of the activities have started, again, going back to the voluntary market, they started with standards that were voluntary standards at the project level. And then all the things that Veronica talked about, permanence, leakage, etc. Scale. Those were issues that were being addressed methodologically at the project level. Activities, site scale activities. And the effort has been over the last 10 years or so to move to jurisdictional approaches, including methodologies that only issue credits to jurisdictional sovereigns. So whether they be national or subnational of a sufficient size and autonomous administratively. And that then requires understanding the role of site scale activities sitting inside of a jurisdiction. And that brings us to questions about nesting project activities inside jurisdictional boundaries and how you account for those, how you credit those, how the funds flow, how benefits are shared and distributed across the system up and down, what the levy system is, what the regulatory approval system is, the permitting, and so forth. And that's kind of the legal context now that a lot of countries are in, because some countries that are putting their Article 6 frameworks in place at the jurisdictional level and moving to jurisdictional nature-based programs are countries where there have been for many, many years very iconic projects that have existed. And those countries don't want to undermine the activities that have been working at the project level. They want to incorporate and value those projects in the context of a national inventory system and a national reporting of performance, including jurisdictional methodological approaches, which now require nesting and harmonization of baselines and of those kinds of things. So just wanted to point out that that's a fascinating area that is becoming way more important now than it was historically for two reasons. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and the national performance of NDCs, and this methodological movement towards jurisdictional RED plus as being kind of like, where the market is moving. So that issue of nesting is going to be really important.
Thanks, Rick. I think we could really spend much more than an hour, 15 minutes on this. There's a lot to talk about. We have a final question to Sam. I just wanted to give a heads up to the audience that we may run a few minutes over time. So feel free to stay if you can. But turning back to Sam, I wanted to ask you a final question into the sustainability of NBS as an asset class, and your thoughts on what legal institutional conditions determine whether the asset is durable over time, and how do we design contract structures, adaptive management models, remediation mechanisms, etc., that can stand challenges of shifting government, changing conditions on the ground, and etc. And just picking one question from the Q&A, how also could you provide some lessons learned from Australia, for instance, that could be transported into other regions? Over to you for your thoughts.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll try and be very, very quick. So I think the really critical issue we've heard in all of the speakers, especially because the asset class that we're talking about is intangible, is the legitimacy, the legal certainty around it. And so I think that is absolutely critical. And that's, for instance, that has many other dimensions, legitimacy, social, environmental, blah, blah, blah. But that is, in fact, underpinned the sort of drop in price for Vera credits is because there have been questions about the legitimacy of it. And so that's absolutely critical. And I think one of the things which is going to be which surprised me is how quickly the 6.4 mechanism is got off running. So, for instance, we've applied for a method under the 6.4 mechanism, a brand new method, wasn't part of the CDM. And I think we threw in, and when my team said, let's do it, I said, yeah, by all means, but it's going to take years before we get processed. But we've been processed, and we're one method's been fully approved, and there are 18 others in the pipeline which are very close to being approved towards the end of this year. And we're one of those 18, and I was absolutely staggered by the speed with that happens. And when we have 6.4, when we have the method registered under 6.4, it really will boost the legitimacy of the method in all the countries that we're working in. So that's really an interesting lesson, which may be not so well known, how quickly the Paris, how quickly the climate change UNFCCC structure is moving on those issues. And I'd encourage people to maybe, if they haven't thought about it, to think about, registering their particular methods with that process, given our experience. And that I think the thing about going back to Marina's question about exporting this is it gets we've had great success in showing that we can replicate. We have a model which works very, very well in Northern Australia, I said, at scale. And we've been able to use that as an example of success and what could happen in your country in 4, 5, 10 years' time. And that has been very powerful. And that has made many of the countries that we're working in realize that there is a great opportunity here. And when they especially realize that when they get to visit Australia and we show them around, and the power and the agency that they see in the communities that are doing this is really very energizing and uplifting, and means that when they go home, they're enthused, and we can find, as I said, there's lots of lessons, very good, interesting lessons in this experience, which demonstrate there are answers to all the problems that we've been highlighting, like permanence, like FPIC, like land tenure, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I get back to that first point I made. I think success is an amazingly powerful tool for change and development, and I would be very happy to connect with any of your listeners and the panel later on to provide more details about each one of these aspects that they might be looking for solutions to.
Thank you very much, Sam. Now, in the final minutes that we have, I would just ask each of you to share some final thoughts in max 1 minute with the audience. And I'd like to pick on 2 points that were posed in the Q&A. First, thinking about how there is obviously in this space a discussion about the commoditization of nature and privatization of nature, and how do we ensure that this is not the case, and to differentiate investment from that, and the interest in developing other types of credits, such as biodiversity credits versus nature credits, and where do we stand with that? And the other interesting question is, as we're talking about the legal infrastructure, should jurisdictions adopt a dedicated NBS framework law, or should these issues be mainstreamed into other existing types of laws, such as environmental laws and etc.? So pick and choose whichever you think is more relevant and more interesting to you. But let me start perhaps with Rick, and we go in the same order for your final thoughts. Thanks.
Give me 1 minute, 1 minute for those 2 questions. All right. That's hard to do. I looked at those as well. I think those are really profound and important questions. But here's what I would say. Dedicated NBS framework law versus integrating it. I think the answer is classic lawyer answer. It depends. I think the process for unpacking this, you have to start with each country's existing legal framework, from the Constitution on down to what existing laws exist. Existing laws exist. Because some countries actually have in their constitution that you cannot commodify nature, or that nature is owned exclusively by the state, and there's legal developments specifically around the commodification piece and whether that's legal or not, and then what you do with that. I think the issue, though, and on that point really quickly, is that what we're trying to do, for better or worse, is use the market system that exists, that runs the global economy and where most of the capital is deployed, usually for things that treat the environment and they treat nature as an externality in that system, but use it to actually help nature and value nature in that system. So in a sense, it is commodification to talk about these markets. But the reality is, in the absence of putting a price and a value on it in that system, the market system, which dominates where capital is deployed and what gets valued and what doesn't, in the economic sense, treats it as zero. So it's sort of like saying, okay, how can we use the market system to actually create value in living ecosystems, as opposed to their only value being in their destruction? So that's just something that it's profound, it's philosophical, it's really important. But how do we finance nature in a way that actually gets to scale? And so that's the question. Um, I forgot the other one, but I'm at a minute, so maybe I'll stop there.
Thanks, Rick. The other one was on biodiversity credits, nature credits, and other types of assets. So maybe I'll turn to Varnika if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. I think the biodiversity market is a lot more nascent than the carbon market. And so it definitely has lessons that can be learned and translated so that we don't make the same mistakes for biodiversity. But that being said, or nature more broadly, biodiversity specifically is so hyper local and context specific that it is harder to apply the same metric ton measure to biodiversity without taking into account the hyperlocal and specific aspects of the specific biodiversity that you are looking to conserve or restore. That being said, there is a lot of work being done on trying to have a financial value attributed to the opportunity that having that biodiversity conservation or restoration project presents. And again, Australia and New Zealand, I think, are leading on this part. And then there's also an IPBES panel that has been doing a lot of work on biodiversity credits. I think just on the question on NBS laws and whether there should be one legal framework, I would say, as Rick said, you need more holistic review of the law, but more specifically, even if you do have like a state coming up with a climate change law, which essentially looks to nature-based solutions as an example, that can only be implemented if several different government bodies are working together, because you do need finance, tax, environment, forestry, all of these to be working together to create and attribute that ecosystem value within the system and step away from the risk of commodification of nature without that underlying environmental or social impact being accurately measured.
Thank you very much, Varnika. Jesse, over to you for your final thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just take the biodiversity credits concept, and the way I think about it as a developer is when we're designing a project, again, our goal is conservation for profit and ecosystem restoration or protection. And so are there cheaper ways so we plant a mix of native species of trees that's designed to look like the forest that was there 100 years ago. And so there are cheaper ways to issue carbon credits in the tree space. We could just, if we're in Brazil, plant a bunch of eucalyptus, or in the US, plant a bunch of fast growing GMO pine. But we take a different approach. And so thinking through like what a market for biodiversity and water credits, water quality credits, and stacking those all into a single project, I think there's a bunch of things that get complicated if you keep slicing up the benefits of a project in these ways. Additionality is kind of an underpinning of all of this, and so I don't know how you separate the types of trees we're planting from the carbon that's getting issued from the animals that come back kind of naturally. So I don't have a great answer there. Right now we kind of, in our contracts, we reserve, what are they called, we treat these co-benefits as a separate concept, and we contractually decide who gets to make those claims or not. But when I go to a Microsoft or any other large buyer, they have desires about what the project is going to look like from a biodiversity standpoint and a community engagement standpoint. All those things cost additional money above and beyond what it would cost to just maximize the carbon potential in a project. But how you slice and dice that is it's the hardest part of this business, in my opinion, at this point.
Thanks, Jesse. Over to Sam for your final thoughts.
I'm very sympathetic to Jesse's comments. The experience in Australia is that there's big benefits to biodiversity, but none of the project managers capture that because it's too intensive in terms of monitoring and too imposes too much on their community values and et cetera, et cetera. So, despite the attempts by the government to try and generate a nature-based biodiversity credit system, it's a long way off a reality, and its complexity on the ground is really, really quite unattractive for people who are managing projects on the ground. And I'd say the same about the nature-based solutions framework. Both are examples of where the perfect is the enemy of the good. If you're looking to develop what we've been doing, a project scaling them across Africa and Latin America, trying to develop a framework, even a carbon policy, is a decadal kind of approach. And a nature-based solution framework would be even more complicated. So looking at long, long, long time frames. So if you want to do something now, you find the easiest pathway forward. Like I said, we looked into the property law system and found this profit prendre route. And that gets back to what Rick was saying about the utility of these voluntary markets. I think there's so much value to being able to do things practically in these spaces. It just opens up people's eyes and markets very, very quickly. And that experience is really powerful. So that's what happened in Australia. The very first savanna burning project was a private contract. It was predated any of the policy, but it became incredibly powerful for developing the policy because the experience was there and the government could see the benefits and the community. So I think it's a bit of both. I mean, you really got to, if you want to open up new markets, you can't. A framework approach is going to be a very, very difficult way to open it up. So be a bit more practical. So from our perspective as a developer, we just look for the low-hanging fruit and then hope everything else kind of opens up after that.
Thank you very much, Sam, and I'm really sorry actually to have to close this discussion. I think we weren't unfortunately able to answer all the questions in the Q&A, nor to really to exhaust all the issues that are involved with this topic. But as I mentioned, we do hope that this conversation will go on. Varnika just sent me an important reminder that we will be publishing a blog post in our LinkedIn group out of this webinar, where hopefully we can address the questions that weren't answered. And just to say that, in fact, we really run this climate change law specialist group with the hope that it will be a profitable space to address these issues and for lawyers and practitioners to exchange. So if you're interested, membership to the climate change law specialist group, and in fact of WCL, is open to anyone with a legal degree. So do engage with us if you have the time and interest. We do run a climate change law network on LinkedIn, which is an easy space for quick exchanges of experiences, of knowledge. So please do make use of that. And we do hope to see you soon in other opportunities. A few of us are going to be next month at the Innovate for Climate conference in Singapore, where some of these discussions will take place again. From the World Bank, we're going to be launching a legal toolkit for carbon market legislation. Rick is going to be there with us, and so if you're there, do reach out, and we will share information about these events through our networks as well. Let me thank, in particular, all the speakers, obviously, for your contributions. I think this has been super interesting, but in particular to Varnika, who was really the organizer and brought us together today. So thank you very much for that. And with that, I wish you all a good rest of your days wherever you are, and to see you soon sometime.